now I have pressure.
There might be a word here.
Not in my world, it's not. Uh-oh. A little bit of, yeah. It's science fiction if Jules Verne was still alive right now. I just like it, it's a little bit more retro, and I like the rustiness and the oxidation. I'm sorry, I've already started talking about stuff.
And I'm moderating you.
Sorry.
Okay. All right. We're going to get started now. I'm sorry. Sorry, guys. Shut up, Ren. Okay. Welcome. My name is Kiana Kirkland. I'm the editor-in-chief of Taleria Press, a local independent press right here in Seattle. And I'll be moderating your panel. And I'll let the guys introduce themselves. Do you want to start?
Yeah, my name is Ben Thompson. I run a website called Badass of the Week, and I wrote 3 books, all with badass in the title. It's military nonfiction, but written in a style that's not like a typical history book. And so I'm working on these 3. I've got another deal right now to do 3 nonfiction stories for like a younger audience, like a high school, middle school kind of audience that you could put a book on the syllabus and not be lynched by the PTA.
You have to make it
They don't like badass. I don't know why you can't get badasses.
asterisk.
I did a reading for my my stepdaughter's school, and I had to put a Post-it note over the ass.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I'm Ren Cummins. I'm also an author. I've written a couple of steampunk series, and I also am a co-founder of Taleria Press, and dad and bald guy. I don't know.
Very nice.
Thank you. I try to keep the facts.
And today we're going to talk about researching your novels, researching your nonfiction, why you should do it, and how to go about doing it. To begin with, I'm going to ask a few questions to get the ball rolling. If you guys are interested in asking questions of your own, there's a microphone right here in the center of the room. We'll want to line up there, and then we'll call on you to have your questions answered. So to get started, I'm going to ask Ren, in a fiction book, why do you think it's important to do research?
Can you hear me with this, or do I have to put it a little closer? A little closer? All right. Closer.
A little more intimate, a little softer. I have enjoyed these soft sounds, Jazz.
That's my DJ voice. Sorry. I went to a writing convention a long time ago with an author named Tracy Hickman, if you're familiar with the Dragonlance books. And he gave a really nice talk about world building. And we talked about how he studied the tectonic plates and continent drift and underwater currents and everything, and weather patterns. It was really cool. And he says, I'm really focused on the idea that when people ask us how we created this world, that we don't just go, oh, the magic. And so I, because I'm a jerk, asked him a question at the very end, and they opened up the Q&A. I said, well, how do you explain the existence of dragons in a world with no superior predator and not just taking over the whole world? Magic. So he chewed me out later on. It was kind of cool. The idea that I took away from that is that even in a fantasy world, if you just kind of unhinge yourself from any kind of reality or physics, when people read them, they aren't going to be able to buy into it. So your language design, your cultural design, your economics, your politics, your sociology, it has to be built upon a framework that people are going to be able to grasp onto. And once they have that foundation of reality, then you can introduce things like magic and science and steam engines and cool stuff, giant robots. Because if you have a reality, a foundation of actual science, of actual reality that people are accustomed to, they'll trust you more to take them on those flights of fantasy.
Yeah, I think that what I've heard is like, yeah, every time you ask them to make the jump, like you get it further and further away. So you can't like throw a bunch of jumps at them at once. You can't be like, well, there's dragons and also steam engines and also like zeppelins. So you have to like, you kind of have to like lead it in. One thing that
You can't, but just slowly.
you have to lead it into it. Yeah, because I read a book. One of my favorite books is a book called Blood Oath. It's by a guy named Christopher Farnsworth, and it's about, he takes one piece of reality. He says, in 1864 there was a ship that came into Boston, and everybody was dead except for one guy who was covered in blood. And they convicted this man of being a vampire. It's the only time that anybody has ever been convicted of being a vampire in the United States, and he was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted to life in an asylum by the president, Andrew Johnson.
So he takes their immortal, it's fantastic.
Right, so he says, he takes that one little piece of information and he says, okay, well what if instead of actually life in an asylum, the president says, I'll, commute your sentence if you promise to defend the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and it becomes a secret agent vampire. So you start with that, and you're like, okay, well that's, he started with some reality, so I can buy into that, and then, it starts with okay, he's a secret agent vampire, I can get on board with that, and then it gets weirder and weirder, but it keeps getting gradually let in, gradually let in, gradually let in, and then at the end of it, you're sitting there and you're gripped with this thing, and I'm not, you're gripped in it, and you're just like, man, I hope the president's vampire can defend the Oval Office from these Frankensteins that were created out of dead U.S. Marines from Afghanistan. And so yeah, if you can gradually get there, it's a lot better than just being okay, well, Dr. Frankenstein's a plastic surgeon in reality, and he's making Frankensteins out of dead American soldiers, and
You have to lead them there.
you have to leave the lead into it.
There's
Spoilers, by the way.
Yes, spoilers. There's a movie called Spirited Away by Hayao Miyazaki. It's absolutely fantastic. I love it. And it starts out with a very simple premise. It's a girl with her parents who make a wrong turn, end up at an abandoned amusement park.
Sorry, that's my alarm to come to this panel.
It totally works.
I snoozed it instead of turned it off.
So the premise is very simple. Girl, parents, abandoned amusement park. An hour and a half later, the girl is on a train going across the water with a demon with no face, a mosquito that used to be a witch's crow, and a hamster that used to be a giant baby. And you go, how did you get me here? And it's awesome. It's the same thing. It's oh no, red crow. Red crow. And an hour and a half later, you're like, I am in a weird place. And she has to rescue her parents who've been turned into pigs.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning, and you're sitting there, you're sitting on your couch, and you're like, how did I get here? What happened?
This book is made of drugs. Did we go off topic a bit?
No, I was
Okay,
delighted. Let's talk a little bit about your research process. How do you know that you want to start a particular topic? What is your process when, for example, you're doing Badass? And do you hear about someone? People suggest people. How do you get started on that first step into research?
I just Wikipedia everything. Just kidding, don't do that. I did history. What this is it's 40. I took 40 of my favorite historical figures, and I cut their life stories down to 4 or 5 pages, and I just tell the good parts, the sex, drugs, murder, mayhem, rock and roll, all that good stuff. And so, I started working it as a website where I did history in college. I've always been really into history. I read it in my spare time, and so I just started writing, the stories that I knew, and I maybe had 5 or 6 when I started doing it, and I would get suggestions through the website for other characters that I could write about, or I'd be researching one guy and I'd find something else out while I was there, and I'd be I have to come back to this guy, and then the more I did it, the more I kind of was able to find new things to write about, which has been really cool. And basically I don't remember the question.
How did you get started on your research on an individual character? And I think you really covered how.
That's my
yeah,
answer.
good job. Thank you. For you, Ren, in a fictional world, how do you know when you need to do research and what to do it on? 2 questions.
Somebody actually asked me this morning. I don't know. They asked me yesterday. It's a long weekend. Or if I went to school, what I majored in, and what college did for me. And the best piece of advice I got was actually from one of my English professors, who said, if you're going to college in English, you're going to learn how to be a good English teacher. If you want to be a writer, you have to learn about everything. Everything is going to play a part in what you write. You have to, if you want to be a writer, even if you're writing nonfiction, you have to pretend to be God. Because you're inventing a world, you're inventing reality. And the more detail you provide into it, the more it becomes reality for people who read it. And so I took classes on social anthropology, I took classes on world history, I took classes on, one of the coolest classes I took was completely by accident because I literally didn't read syllabuses back then. But the class ended up being how cities are developed. Like, why do you find like the absolute ultimate history of a city? Like, well, there was a road that connected these two cities, and it was really too far to walk or take a horse from one city to the next. So they built a little city here around an inn because it was near water and shade, and so it used to be an inn, but then people were staying there all the time and wanted to eat, so they attached on, it's like this weird thing of how the city grows and snowballs into a city. I studied classes on the history of English, because I am kind of a word nerd, and I love how words have come to be. First, how they were turned into noises to represent something, but also how those then become applied in the world. And anytime I get to a point where I'm like, well, I don't know how that would happen, research. And I honestly don't know how people wrote 20 years ago and before, because going through like the Dewey Decimal System and the filing cabinets, which I can't even remember how to use those anymore, because now Google tells you everything. Even if it's not true, it points you in the right direction to where you can find the actual information. So it's really amazing. But when I started the book series I just completed, my daughter gave me the challenge. She says, I want you to write about a girl who kicks butt, and she has to wear pretty dresses, have a talking animal companion, and fight zombies. And you're sure about the pretty dresses? Definitely the pretty dresses. Okay, fine. So Death wears a pretty dress. And that ended up becoming my catchphrase for the books. Death wears an adorable black dress. And that was the whole thing. It's like, I was like, well, how do I create a world where people would wear dresses, pretty dresses, sorry, Jelly, pretty dresses, and fight monsters and not have like high-tech stuff. And so I kind of said, well, how about if it's kind of Victorian? Like late 1800s. I said, a dress with petticoats? Definitely petticoats. Okay, Jelly, petticoats. and so that started the groundwork. I'm like, I've never lived in Victorian times that I know of. What was it like there? And so I researched how language was used back there, how society was back there. I gave the character, who was an 11-year-old girl, I gave her swear words that she could use that a proper 11-year-old girl would have used in Victorian times. And so it developed around that. I was like, well, if I get to a point where it kind of sounds like 21st century, I have to research what the world was really like then.
Yeah, and with nonfiction, it's a similar thing. Like any extra details you can bring into the situation are going to just make it more immersive for the person that's reading it. So if you're talking about, you can say like, this guy drove the tank to the front lines and he blew up 3 other tanks with it, and that's cool. You're telling a story exactly the way it happened. But if you can describe like what the inside of the tank looks like, what it would smell like, how you control it, is it a stick, is it a wheel, is there a throttle, is there a gas pedal? If you can describe like what's going on inside of it, how hot it gets inside the tank, what kind of ammunition you use, how much it weighs to like load it into the gun, every little piece of. You want to build this story in your reader's mind down to every rivet so that they can smell the gunpowder, so that they can like feel like they actually were in the war, so they can talk to a person that was actually in a war. They can talk to like their grandpa who was in like World War II and kind of sort of understand a little bit what he was going through, more than just 500 people were on this side and 400 people were on this side and this many people died and that was the end of the war, or whatever, that was the end of the battle. So you want to like really be able to bring it alive so that it's not just so history is not just a bunch of dead old white guys. And obviously you want to be accurate with your data, because it makes you not sound like you know what you're talking about when you're completely wrong about every statistic that you put out there. But there's little things that you wouldn't think that would like completely turn off your readership to what it is that you want to talk about, right? So you're talking about, say you're talking about the Marine Corps in Korea, right? You can't call a Marine a soldier. You can't say like, these soldiers were charged to the front lines. Because they're not soldiers, they're Marines. Soldiers are the Army, the Marines are the Marines. And the Marines are very serious about this. And they do not have a sense of humor about it, and they will close your book and put it away and throw it in the garbage can if you call a Marine a soldier. Because this person, they will read that one line, and it could have been a typo, it could have been a correction that came in through your editor. If they see that, then that's it. They're not interested anymore. But if you get it right, they're happy. So that's, you got to know your target audience, and you got to be aware of, like, you got to do the research down to that level, because you can literally alienate a large group of your target audience by misusing one word.
Excellent.
That's the end of my rating.
I want to move a little bit into research process, and then we'll take some questions. Can you walk me through step by step? So someone sends you an idea or you get a concept. Where do you start with your research, and what resources do you think that maybe might be available to people here who are writing their own books? How do you kind of go about the actual nitty-gritty part of researching, finding information?
Well, I'll start with the Google book search. Like, Google Books is this amazing tool that not only, if you're searching for even the most obscure stuff, you can type it in quotation marks, and not only will it pull up books that you can use for further research, but it will highlight that phrase inside of the book that you're looking for. And the cool thing with Google Books is that you can pull up stuff from that would be in a special collections, because University of Michigan, University of Harvard, Harvard University, a lot of these places have scanned in their special collections into Google Books, and it's all scanned with OCR text so that you can type in words and phrases and have it get pulled up. So, in this book I talk about this guy named Wolfe the Quarrelsome, right? And Wolfe the Quarrelsome is awesome, but he's only mentioned 4 places in history. But you can type it into Google's book search with quotation marks, and it will pull up those 4 instances of it. And so you can get access to books that wouldn't be in your library up the street, that if you went to the library that has the book, you have to go into one of those little rooms where the guy with the white gloves turns the pages for you. So definitely, you want to use your libraries, but you want to use Google Books to kind of get a feel for what for where that goes. I mean, I feel like there's no better tool to start with than that. And then, I don't know, something like that, libraries and personal libraries, and talking to as many people that might have knowledge of this subject as you can find, emailing people that, historical recreation societies are great for, historical military stuff. You email a Civil War reenactor, you're going to get more information on the Civil War than you've ever wanted to know. And, just use every possible resource that you can find to talk to everybody that you know, because you can't have too much information on the subject. Even if you're writing a 1,500-word piece, you can have 17 pages of notes. It's just going to make it that much better, because it's more crap that you can cut out to get down to the good parts.
Excellent. Ren?
I actually really like Wikipedia. I know that there's always the big debate of whether or not it's accurate, whether or not it's valid information. I find it's generally, even if it's not 100% accurate, it gives you a very good direction of where to go. It includes some nice graphics, and there was a short story, a Peter Pan short story anthology I was in, and so I had to go and do all this research. I'm like, wow, the section that I was given, I was like, I don't really know that much technically about all this. I needed some extra technology understanding to write this one section out. So I spent all day researching, and my daughter gets home from school. She's like, what'd you do today, Dad? I said, I learned how to be a pirate. I learned how a pirate ship works. And it was this fun thing that she was just like, wow, my dad, that today he learns about how to be a pirate, tomorrow he's gonna be an astronaut. It's like, I get to be a different thing every single day, which is a lot of fun. Unfortunately, now my daughter wants to be a writer too, so I can't. I know it's missed out. I'm like, I can't urge her off of that. But yeah, all the other resources. Google Books is actually incredibly awesome.
One thing I'll say for Wikipedia is that you should definitely read the Wikipedia entry on whatever it is that you're writing about, because everybody that's fact-checking you is going to check it. But one good thing about Wikipedia is that most of the pages will cite your sources, and what you want to do is you want to track that source down if you can, and go off of that. Because I've had situations where I'll be researching somebody and it'll be cited, this book, this edition, this page, right? And I will have that book, that edition, on my shelf, and I'll pull it up and I'll open to that page, and it's not even talking about the character. So you have to be real careful, even if it's cited, because it's open source. That's great, because there's now 17 billion Wikipedia pages, but you have to double check their sources, because sometimes, history and, even something that you wouldn't think of, like how pirate works, history is a very powerful tool that you can use to influence things and propagandize things, and everybody has an opinion, and history is not an objective thing, it's a very subjective thing where you can twist it into being whatever it is whatever argument you're trying to make, you can bend and warp history to kind of supplement you, to make you sound like whatever the word I'm looking for. I'm a writer here, you guys. Somebody help me. But
If you're gonna make stuff up, you should make stuff up, not let them make stuff up for you.
exactly.
That's a great rule of thumb. We're going to open the questions. We have a little line. Would you like to begin?
Thank you all for coming today. I appreciate you spending your time with us. I had a quick question. When you're pulling from 50 bajillion sources, both of you are on the nonfiction side and on the fiction side, how are you organizing them? I mean, do you have a specific system that you use? Is there, with computers, there are software packages, or is there a way that you organize all your notes and like, okay, I'm researching a character now, all of this is the 17 pages of notes on this character that will be distilled into, 4 lines in the book. What is your process for organization?
I use a couple different programs, most of which is I just have a very, very detailed folder sorting within my subfolders on my computer. And by the way, keep backups always. So I keep all the different pages that have information relevant to those characters, relevant to locations, relevant to the world, and I break them down with all the source information, plus I keep the links and the pictures and everything else on just Word docs, just so I can use that. I was also using a program for a while called Scrivener. I don't know if you've ever used that one. Not as adorably user-friendly as I would have liked. I know my way around a computer, but it's like, I don't know this, and I'd like to right now. So I kind of put it aside, but it was actually, what I did see about it was very, very handy in keeping all of your notes organized and keeping detailed information for each chapter. It cross-references very nicely. I can't imagine how hard it would have been to write like on an actual typewriter. Oh my God. Yeah, exactly, right? I love the flexibility of the computer, the immediacy and instantaneousness of, just made up that word, let's see how that works, of being able to pull the information out you need and have it right there available at your fingertips.
Yeah, that's why a lot of old school writers killed themselves. Yeah. No, I do. I have one Word document, Arial 8 points, so that I can scroll through it quickly. And just little headers, but just gibberish sometimes. Just like I'll just alt tab back and forth between my 800 open tabs or the book that I'm reading on my lap, underlining or whatever. Or I'll sometimes I'll read and I'll make notes on a piece of notebook paper, but I'll type all that stuff into this one doc. So it's like, okay, there's a type of gun I'm looking for. That's in caps, and then underneath that is just little things about it, caliber, the guy who used it. It just could be gibberish at some point, but it's all stuff that just to keep it fresh in my mind, so that when I write it, I can just put all that stuff into sentences and cut out the parts that I don't need. And sometimes there's a lot of duplication. If I'm reading 3 or 4 different sources on the same thing, those little sections will have the same facts 2 or 3 different times, but sometimes the numbers are different, so you have to kind of figure out which ones you're going to use and which ones are the most accurate, which ones come up the most, and just base it off that, assemble it from there.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Hello. So Mr. Thompson, you mentioned how you can never really do enough research, but one of the problems that I've found that I run into is I get so sucked into doing research that I don't write. Mm-hmm. So how do you guys decide when you've done enough research and it's time to start writing? And how do you kind of push yourself away from research mode?
Well, what I like to do is I like to set certain times. I think that for most people who are writing, I find that there's a certain time that'll work for you to write, right? So I'm useless afternoon, so I write from 8 to noon, and that's it. And I have friends that will make a pot of coffee after the kid goes to bed, and will write until 2 o'clock in the morning, or whatever it is. I think that one of the things about writing is you have to really think of it as a job, and so you have to set okay, from 8 to noon, I'm not doing anything except writing. And if I don't have enough info, if I don't have the research done that I need to do, because the research is a little bit easier for me, like you said, you can get sucked into it, you can open up one page, and the next thing you know, you're 500, different tabs open, and you're researching all this other stuff. Do that at a time that your brain isn't focused on writing. So if you can get it locked in, Monday to Friday, 8 to noon, I'm gonna write. So you do that, and it doesn't matter if you don't have anything, just write something, write dialogue, write, whatever it is. You can go back and fix it later, but just force yourself to do it, because that's the hardest part of writing fiction, nonfiction, anything, is just not writing enough. And so, when you do your research any other time other than those hours that you've set aside to write, and you write whether you have it or not.
My writing process is very Pavlovian. I have trained my brain to stop doing certain things when I have to write. One of them is I set playlists on my iPod. And for one of my books, I had the first song was off of the Alice in Wonderland soundtrack by Danny Elfman. And so that song would come on like within 10 notes. I couldn't do anything else but write. Because I wouldn't listen to that song at any other time, but once it was, I was like, oh, I'm writing now. And I would always do that. I'd set myself a routine, a very physical routine, that I would make sure I did some walking first to get my body kind of nice and relaxed. I'd have my cup of coffee or orange soda or something, a drink that I was really in the mood for right then. I had my playlist ready to go, and I would hit play, take a drink, and go, now I'm writing. And also, I closed the door to my office so that my wife and child don't come in and go, hey, Dad, can we go? No, nothing, I'm ready. But I would set myself very physical parameters that told my entire brain, we're not doing anything else right now but writing.
Okay.
It's also very helpful to turn the internet off. Because otherwise it's like, oh, hey, what's up on Facebook right now? Stop! You know, it's nice to have that absolute focus, kind of an insulated chamber.
I have a computer that's not set up with it or whatever. There was a library by my house that I used to write at sometimes when I was really like pushed on the deadline. Because you go in there and you can use that computer for an hour. And it's like I plug in my flash drive and I have an hour and that ticker is going down and it's just like I have to do this, I have to make this happen, you know, because at the library it sucks, you want to go home, and at the library it sucks, it's probably not the right thing to say to research. But yeah, I mean,
you librarians here, we're really
I saw like three arms go up and be like, oh, stop fucking out of here. It's important not to alienate your target audience, you know.
Thank you so much.
You guys aren't going on my book list. No, really. Thank you for coming, and I've read Badass, some of your books.
Oh, cool.
Fun stuff. I haven't read yours yet, but I'm starting to get into steampunk, and you're on my to-do list. Your books are, sorry.
I'm in the doghouse with this guy.
Become a different convention all of a sudden.
It's more Norwestcon than I think.
I kind of wanted to push the library a little bit for research because in writing some of my own short stories, I've said, you know what, I've got this 1920s jazz singer, but I don't know what kind of slang that I want her to use. And rather than going back and watching old movies, which might give me, oh, that's how gangsters talk, but not how a jazz singer brought up in the suburbs would talk, you can go to the library and just ask the librarian. And if you can't find something through your Google searches, a librarian might be able to find something that I found, the Writer's Guide to the 1920s. And they have one for each decade going back to the last 100 years. That is helpful.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like I was doing a book on Vikings that's coming up next year, and it you know, I did all this research onto the different Vikings in the books or on the internet and all that. But then I went to like the 4 different libraries near my house, and I just typed in Vikings, and you go and there's a section. It's every friggin' Viking book you can think of. I mean, the section's like this fat instead of this fat, but I just grabbed everything off the shelf, and you grab stuff that you wouldn't think that you were going to look at before. You pick like, you know, the Kid's Guide to Vikings or whatever, or like, you know, Vikings for like the Traveler's Guide to like Viking burial sites or something, and you're just like, this doesn't seem particularly interesting, but like, or relevant to what I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to grab it. And then you'll pull out little things, like I said, like you want to know what it's like, you know, like I said with driving the inside of a tank. You know, you find something about, oh, well, actually Viking burial sites are pretty interesting, and here's this cool thing about it, and here's this thing that I can work into to this nonfiction story about this guy and how he would have been buried. And, you know, you get access to a lot of stuff that isn't available on the internet.
Exactly.
And it's like a legitimate source too. You don't like have to put in a URL in your references.
Your teachers don't like that. But my question was, like I said, I'm trying to get into steampunk, and I find it a little impenetrable because it's either the really hardcore science fiction like The Difference Engine, which is intense, or soulless, which is as much smut in some places as it is science fiction. And that's, some people really like it. It wasn't my thing.
We got the author here. And
I've had so many people come up to me and say, I love this series, I want more like it. And I'm like, I don't think you've read the whole thing, there's more. And let me give you the graphic novels. But those are the 2. far into science fiction as I'm going to go. I'm not going to cross the line into fantasy. How did you decide, okay, vampires are okay, but I'm not going to do werewolves? Where do you stop yourself?
I stopped where it starts being relevant to the story.
Okay.
Like I didn't write a story about, in fact, I didn't, confession time, I didn't even really know about steampunk until I was almost done with my first book. And one of my readers was like, hey, this is kind of like steampunk. I said, so what? And they're like, steampunk, you know, sci-fi, Victorian stuff. I'm like, there's a name for that? It's really awesome. And like, well, you just wrote a book about steampunk. I didn't know I had. And in fact, most steampunk authors I've talked to kind of accidentally, like there's a big steampunk labeled hole in the backyard. We all got fell in, like, what are you doing here? I wrote steampunk, I guess. I mean, like I was saying earlier, I wanted to write a story about an 11-year-old girl who fights monsters and gets to wear pretty dresses. And Victorian times kind of seemed like the right pick for that. I wanted to pick a time period where it wasn't all high tech. But I also love the retro, the hyper-retro feel of the steampunk I have seen, which I didn't, again, realize it was steampunk at the time. But I didn't want to do what I see a lot of, and not just steampunk, but a lot of authors of various subgenres tend to do, is they go, I'm going to write a steampunk novel. Steampunk, steampunk, steampunk. And like, really? Just write a novel. Write a book. Write a story about a character that happens to be steampunk. And that was really what I wanted to do. I did the whole defend and destroy, or defend or destroy philosophy. It's a concept for interior design, but it kind of works for books too, where you distill it down to the basic core. Like, what's this really about? What's the story arc? And then if it's not relevant, scrape it off and keep the story consistent with what the flow should be. There's a part where they kind of have to fight not really dead things. And I'm like, I don't want to do vampires, and I don't want to technically do zombies. I'm definitely not going to call them zombies. I made them something different, and in fact, I didn't know what I was going to call them until the first time the main character cut one of them open and sand poured out. I'm like, literally, it's like I was as surprised as she was. And I'm like, I'm going to call them sand. I know, right? I did the same exact thing. I'm like, oh my God, talk to me more often. It was kind of at the moment where literally it's like the name came out very organically. And I think most stories should be like that. The story should flow very organically. If there's something that pops up, you're like, well, that's kind of weird. That doesn't seem to make sense. Oh, they're all werewolves now. Ooh. It's like, don't do it. And that's why I think a lot of people do kind of fall. And because steampunk is a very new, well, steampunk fans will hit me for saying that. It's actually been around for 150 years, but it's a recent label, and it's kind of a trendy thing to do right now. So everyone wants to have their steampunk dystopian young adult book. But if it's not relevant to the story, then it doesn't have to be steampunk unless it's absolutely part of the setting.
Yeah, I'd say just in general with any kind of fiction or nonfiction, just write what you love, you know? You want to do a book about like vampires that like get shot out of a cannon and like land on the moon and fight raptors, it's like, okay, cool, write that, you know? Yeah, just because if you yeah, I mean, you want to do that, then do it, like, because if you know, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear here, but if you bullshit the audience, they're going to know it. Like, if you're passionate about it, it matters more that you're into it than like, because they'll know. And if you're passionate about it and you're excited about it, then you can get them excited about it, regardless of what it is you're talking about. So as long as you're into it, like, I feel like you go for it. If it's something you want to see, like, I never saw a blue duck before, so I wanted to paint one. Like, just do that with your book, you know? That would be my advice, I guess.
I'm going to make them fight werewolves because that's possible.
Thank you.
How would a werewolf survive in space?
That's a vampire. He's on the moon. He's on the moon. He's powerful all the time.
Next question.
You should write this, not me.
Yeah, circling back to something that Ben alluded to a couple times, one thing about doing research is that, you know, we all know that history is written by the winners, and that if you're looking at history and trying to tell a story that is maybe not from the point of view of, you know, the dead white guys who colonized everybody else. But the flip side is, you know, I found it's pretty hard to find stuff that's written, you know, unfortunately I only speak English, so I have to read it in that, and finding sources that are, from an alternative viewpoint, but that are still accessible to us. I don't know if either of you have any experience with that or thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Google Translate can be brutal to try to slog through if you're going through like a website on another it's in another language. One thing that has been helpful for me in a situation like that is like if you find like go online and like try to find some people that will speak the language and will translate stuff for you, or you can pay like a translation service to translate documents for you. Some books are printed in multiple languages, even if it's hard to find them, you can find them in English. The good thing about being an English speaker is that a lot of people speak English as a second language. So if you can get in touch, like email the people who run the website that has some information that you think might be useful, and email them just in English. Hey, I'm sorry, I don't speak your language, but I'm really interested in what you're talking about. I can't read it. Google Translate's brutal, and sometimes you get like a letter back that's written better than like your friend from high school. So it's difficult and it's hard because if you try to write about an obscure character or something from a different culture, it can be really, really, really tough. But there's certain things that you can do to try to get around it. Like I said, like trying to find people that will speak it, or trying to just email people directly, or if there's an author that you like, try to write them an email or the Twitter at them or something like that. Try to get in touch with them and try to make personal correspondence with them so that they can translate the stuff for you.
Networking is definitely your friend. One of the obstacles I've always come into is that I'm trying to understand more aboriginal, more ancient, more prehistorical civilizations, and understanding how the people lived at that time. And one of the big epiphanies I had at one point when I started this whole process, back in college when I was living these anthropology classes, was that the people 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago were people. They looked up at the sky, they made pictures, they looked around them, figured out how they're going to make food for their families. The things that they needed, the things that they wanted, the things that they kind of dreamed about, the things that they were passionate about, weren't that much different from us. Less video games, less DVR concerns. Their needs and their wants were much more immediate. How do we stay warm? How do I protect my family against the monsters? And a lot of times, you can't, like we were talking about before, you can get kind of lost in the research, where it's like there's just libraries and libraries, there's an infinite amount of information. Kind of tying back into that, the idea should be that research until you are full, and then digest it. And if you run into an obstacle, reach out to people who have more knowledge than you, because there's always going to be at least one. And learn about that. And this is going to be a little bit of a rant here, but we have kind of lost our bardic tradition that we used to tell stories to our children. We used to tell stories, we used to listen to our grandparents tell stories about the war, about the Great Depression, about these things that they used to experience. And now, rather than talking to them about that, we just looked up on Wikipedia. We need to close that circle. We need to remember how we don't just pass along information, but how we transmit the culture, the essence of that which we are, and pass those things down from generation to generation. I'm going to give you guys a homework assignment because I can, because I have the microphone and I'm going to have a jerk's day. This week, discover a story from your ancestors, your personal ancestors, 2, 3, 4 generations back. Discover a story, and I'll even tell you one. I have a several great uncle who was a salesman. He used to sell grandfather clocks. And this was back 1800s. He got in trouble because he would sell grandfather clocks in states that were actually built in other states, and there was no real established interstate commerce law at the time. So he got in trouble for that. And so he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll do something different. I'll buy all the parts, and then I'll go to your state and I'll put this thing together, and look, it's a grandfather clock built in this state. Ha ha ha. So they arrested him. And he got a lawyer. The lawyer actually not only helped him be found innocent, but also helped establish interstate commerce law. His lawyer's name, Abraham Lincoln. Wow. So do that this week. Find out a story from one of your ancestors. And let's close this circle. Let's bring research back to the personal level. Let's understand who we are and where we come from.
And it's a really good point too, because like even going along with what you were saying, like yeah, there's the victors write the history books. There's the British colonists saying, well, these Indian porters have enlarged spleens, and that's why they keep dying when we kick them in the spleens. But there's also like if you look at anything, even if you look at like current events, two people can be on the same team witnessing the exact same event from a distance of 5 feet away, and they'll remember it differently, and they'll write it down differently, and they'll argue with each other about what actually happened. And you don't know if one person's lying because it makes them look bad, or if one person just didn't see it right, or maybe looked the other way, or he processed the information differently. So like every other viewpoint that you can get is definitely worth checking out. It's great.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go for the speed round. We're running a little low on time, so if everybody could be brief. We'll try and get through these last 4 questions in the next 10 minutes or so.
I'll snap it in 2 seconds.
Do it. Ready? Go.
Would you buzz in?
Hello. My question is about research from a slightly different angle, and that is, what are your perspectives on integrating personal experience into stories or narrative descriptions? Do you personally go out and try and experience things that you're researching, or do you tend to just unconsciously integrate stuff, or do you try not to integrate personal experience?
Like method acting?
I guess. Or even just people you know or places you've been.
Absolutely. My college professor I had, he when he told me about learn everything, one of the things he pointed out was he says knowing how to write is one thing. That's kind of a technical thing. Knowing what to write about is based upon who you are and the world you live in. So he says you're going to learn about the technique here. If you want to write a story, you have to go out there and live it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. Like, if you're going to write about, like, if you're going to write a military story, then go to the gun range and shoot a gun and see what it feels like, so that you can describe it in a way that, like, you wouldn't be able to if you were reading about it in a book. And then write that off on your taxes because it's a business expense. You can't. It's not always feasible to like go to like the Imperial War Museum in London every time you want to like write about a British tank. But you can go to your museums here. You can check them out. You can go like if you're writing about just try to do as much of it as you can. As much of it's like feasible to do. Go to the places that you're going to write about so you know what they look like, because it's like hearing the story from your grandfather. Like you were there, you saw it with your own eyes. You know what it's like, and you can describe it in a way that you might not have been able to by reading about it.
People, as a general rule, love to talk about themselves. Ask them what they do. Ask them what it's like. Ask them to pick their brain. A lot of people will say yes.
Thank you.
And they will never shut up about it. Forever, and you're like, I already got what I wanted like 25 minutes ago.
No, but please go on.
I have a question about world building. When you're building a world, how do you even know what you're missing? I've tried and I don't even know what I don't know. So where do you start your research?
That's a good one.
Quick, 2 sentences.
Know this world. Research weather, research geography, research everything. And if you see words you don't know, research those words too. For me, being able to build a world meant I understand the world I live in, because it's a great example of a world where people can live. So if you can understand how this world works, physics, math, geography, all the stuff that they told us we'd never use in school, now you get to use it.
Yeah, I mean, I look, as a historian, I always say look at the history, like everything that exists today has come this way through history. So various things have happened in the past to make the world the way it is today. So when you're building your world, don't just think about the way you want it to be right now. If you've got I've got these 3 kingdoms and they're all at war and there's dragons. And it's like, okay, well, where'd the dragons come from? Where'd the 3 kingdoms come from? Just give them a little bit of background. It doesn't even have to be a ton, but just start thinking about you got to think about where did they come from? How did they get here? What are their motivations? What are they trying to do? And then that will bring out 1,000 more questions that you can answer, and then ask questions about that. It doesn't have to be super deep. You don't have to include all of it in your story. You don't have to include after the Big Bang this happened and this planet was formed. But if you have that information available, you can put in 1 sentence in your story that will just add a whole layer of depth. Be like, oh, this is from that war that happened back then, and that's why these 2 kingdoms hate each other. And all of a sudden, it'll click for the reader. You've added a bunch of depth just by adding a little tiny bit of history to it.
She edited my books, and every time I'd mention it, she's like, where's this? I'm like, oh, here you go. And she's like, stop mentioning stuff that never happens in the story. I'm like, but it's background.
Some of it's background.
Thank you.
This might be a little bit better to direct at Ren, but what happens if you're going to write about something that doesn't exist? You want to write about a mermaid or a dragon, and you want to explain the biological process of breathing fire. Do you just pick, like, how might that happen, and then try to research, everything related to fire making?
Exactly. Like, don't let yourself get cornered like Tracy Hickman and say, oh, magic. Figure out a real explanation. Figure out how it could really be done. Some things, we like taking little shortcuts and going, well, it just seems like magic to people who aren't there. Find a good physiological explanation. Sure, there aren't any things that breathe fire. There are things that breathe water, though.
Okay.
And there are mammals that live in the sea. So, you've got some reality to build on. Once you figure out the basic physics of something, how something really does exist, it doesn't really take that much to tweak that and make it functional within your world.
Yeah, there's so many weird friggin' creatures in the world that, like, you can find something that can kind of, like, friggin' termites shoot acid or some shit out of their head. I don't know much about science, but I've been told this before. But yeah, no, there's so many weird animals that, like, you could look to as like, oh, well, maybe he's got this part of this and this part of this, and just make it be one jump instead of two, and try to find how.
In a world where a platypus exists, anything is possible. Watch National Geographic Channel. They show some weird, freaky stuff on there. And the other day I was watching a show with my daughter, and she's like, Dad, what's that? I'm like, I have no idea. Is that a plant or a fish? It's moving, but it's a plant. Oh, it's weird. I love it.
There's a plant in Australia that kills people. There's a stinging tree, and it kills people. And it's like, the most poisonous animal in the world is a freaking jellyfish. Like, there's all kinds of weird stuff out there. So you got to think like, okay, I'm going dragon. He's a reptile. Let me look at some weird reptiles and what do they do? And I want him to breathe fire. So let's look at stuff that breathes things. So like, how does this guy breathe acid? How does he breathe water? How does he how do we make fire? How does a freaking flamethrower work? Because that's an important thing to know if you're going to figure out how he breathes fire. What do you need? You need a lighter. You need a can of WD-40. Okay, we got this.
Thank you very much.
Dragon is actually just mechanical lubricant.
Yeah, that's the story. Dragons are bullshit, and you don't find out till the last page. And you're like, oh, it's like how to Baskervilles was a robot the whole time. Spoiler.
So I get in this argument with my friend all the time with mythical beasts. When is the proper time to go between stuff that you actually find in research and when to tweak it to fit your story? Where is that line?
It's kind of the horizon. It kind of moves as the story requires it. I like not having the same point of definition for reality in where research stops and where fantasy begins. Because I like people kind of guessing, like, well, is this kind of one of the key kind of things I do with my steampunk books is I have an actual social division between magic, which I just call art, and science, and it's actually become a civil war with them. Because the scientists are like, we know how this stuff works, and you guys are all just, ooh, magical singing and blah, blah, blah. And it's this big cultural division between them. And where it starts becoming interesting is that some of the characters on each side of this wall have discovered that if you take belief so far, it becomes truth. If you take truth very far, it becomes faith. And they begin discovering that the line between science and art is a lot less clear than they once believed. And so I let the actual definitions of we'll call it reality, blur a bit between the fantasy and the projected reality, to kind of emulate that same understanding that they were coming to learn about in the world as well. So I wanted the people to be guessing just as much as the people who read it go, oh, because I thought that was magic, and that's actually something, ooh, that's kind of interesting. Like I wanted them to do the same thing that the people in the books would do.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to add a little bit of like magical stuff, like, oh, this is a beast with 3 heads, and one's a goat, and one's a dragon, and one's a lion, and the tail's a viper. Okay, well, how does this work? But you can make the jump a little bit, and you can have a little bit of like supernatural stuff in there, but you got to make it consistent, and you got to explain it. I would say, if you have a reason why this thing works or why the dragon can breathe fire, like you put that in there, and then you make that consistent, because the way that you're going to torpedo yourself in a situation like that is by making your fake facts contradict each other. So I mean, if you can come up with a way that maybe it'll work, as long as you can keep it consistent, you can still keep the audience.
I did a short story for an End of the World anthology that we just happened to do, or gratuitous plug, and the short story's about the end of the world in that all these gods were sitting around having their end of year mixer, and everybody started giving the guy from the Mayan religions a lot of crap because, hey, wasn't your world supposed to end in 2012? So he got really drunk and broke the world. And in that one, I didn't worry about science because it didn't matter. For that world, it was just going to be a fantasy story. And so once you decide what your story is, what your basic premise is going to be, that becomes the rule of how your universe exists. So if you say, in this world, this is going to be where we pretend that people actually do throw mythological, magical hammers and they come back, and this is where this kind of thing can happen just because they want them to. Or in this world, I want it to be pure fantasy, but grounded inexplicably in actual science. Or I want this to be just science. You, as the god of the world that you create, get to make that rule. And once you do it, though, stick with it.
And we're at time.
Wow.
Thanks, guys.